So I think there's something that gets in the way for people when we're trying to get to know ourselves, or that it feels scary. And we can only be as good for other people as we are to ourselves, right? And when it's hard for people to look in the mirror, what are some of those things that get in the way of us really digging deep?
What gets in the way, or what?
Yeah, what gets in the way,
Okay.
like in your experience?
Busyness is the first. Like this idea that I don't have enough time. I'm not sure that that's totally it. I relate to that.
Yeah.
So let's say you've got a bit of time, and it happens. It doesn't need to happen like in this come to enlightenment moment, but it happens more. Let's say you're reading something, or there's a conversation with somebody, and you're in a relatively safe environment. Okay, so it's not necessarily a board meeting. It's not necessarily, on the sidelines. Okay,
Consequential.
yeah, let's say that it's not that, but you're in an environment. You're amongst friends or family, and you're either reading something. Let's do the conversation bit, and you feel something. Is to check in and like, what is that feeling? And most of us are afraid we're going to fall into 1,000 pieces, or because if we oversimplify emotions for just a moment, and we just talk about 4 emotions. There's research that there's 200 plus emotions. There's some that might stick to the basic 7. But so if you just think about 4 for a minute, there's anger, there's fear, and call those scales, right? There's lots of words we would use to describe big anger, like rage, and then small anger, which is maybe annoyed or something, right? So the anger scale, the fear scale, the happiness scale, and then what am I missing? Sadness scale. Okay, did I say sad?
No, you didn't
scary.
say.
Yeah.
So sadness isn't attached to anger.
Well, so this is the point here. No, they're completely different.
Okay.
And anger, frustration, intolerance, whatever word on that scale that you would choose of intensity, is a secondary emotion. So the first emotion is something on the sad scale, like hurt or let down, or let's call it one of those, or something on the fear scale. And so those are so difficult to deal with that we go to an action emotion, which is anger, which is driving action, like emoting towards change in that direction. And so, but those first 2 are so difficult and so scratchy to deal with that we don't practice those 2. And so we deal more with intolerant frustration, agitation, pissed off, annoyed, whatever it might be. And so if you're in a conversation with somebody, go back to the scenario, and you feel something, and let's say the first impulse or the first thing that you recognize is the pissed offness, whatever it is. If you take a second beat and you go underneath, it's something on the fear scale or something on the sad, like hurt scale, and you work from that emotion, you're just getting a rep. It's just a rep.
Yeah.
And so it's sets and reps of what we learn in sport, right? If you want to get better at something, you got to do a bunch of reps. You need to do a bunch of sets to get stronger, more dynamic, flexible, whatever. Same true with emotions. So that's a way to do a rep. And if you're amongst people that you trust, you can get a rep in.
Yeah.
And if you're not if that feels a little too intense when you're reading or writing, say you're journaling or whatever, that's another way to get it in. And so when you're driving and you're listening to music, that's another way to get it in. When you're listening to a conversation, a podcast, or whatever it might be, and something gets stirred up, is if you can just stay in that stirred upness for a little bit of more time.
Yeah.
You might cry.
Yeah.
You might laugh. You might rattle a little bit in fear. But if you can do those emotions before you get to the agitation, irritation, you're getting a rep at working with emotions. And that's all going deep is. Yeah. So the question is about what gets in the way? We become overwhelmed or overrun by the first trigger of emotion. And so that's the beginnings. And then the second part is when you feel an emotion, to stay in that emotion for just a little bit longer than before is how the transformation, the growth takes place. Yeah. So you just stay in a little bit longer than you did before. And what ends up happening, emotions don't last very long. And unfortunately, as soon as you name the emotion, it dissipates. As soon as you locate where the emotion is in the body, it begins to dissipate. So when you become mindful and aware of the emotion, it dissipates. But the idea is to just attune to it a little bit longer than you did before. And that would be a pretty radical commitment to oneself.
Yeah, it's powerful. And it really takes me to like that mind body connection, which a lot of athletes, that's the way we kind of relate to life. And, you figure that out over time. But so many people are doing like the hot and cold exposure things and like that training of your nervous system. And another one of my favorite people, Emily Hightower, I don't know if you're familiar with her work, but she does this, she talks about widening the window of tolerance.
There you go.
And so there are a lot of activities that we can do physically that will also help us widen that window of tolerance.
Yeah, it's building the capacity, is one of the, again, it's a first principle in adaptation is to build capacity. So widening the window sounds like being able to hold on to, or not hold on, but experience more for longer.
Yeah.
And in athletes, and I think your statement holds up in so many ways. And then I want to also put an asterisk in there because my experience of some of literally the tip of the spear folks is that there can be a numbing. So we learn to numb our emotions. We learn to numb pain. We learn to numb things. And that is, it's the path maybe to be able to widen the tolerance to build capacity, but it's not necessarily the same path for depth and enlightenment and openness and buoyancy and wisdom. So there's a slightly different nuance between that.
Yeah. And I mean, do you get to do that at the highest levels?
Yeah.
When you're Felix Baumgartner, do you get to do that?
Felix jumped from outer space at 130,000
that
feet.
documentary is
Oh, did you see that?
epic. Yeah. It's so good.
Yeah, so there's two parts. One is like when Felix was on the edge of the capsule, 130,000 feet above Earth, and that is an incredibly consequential environment. The brightest minds in aerospace were not sure if he was going to make it. When he passed through a transonic experience, if his legs and his arms would stay intact. So when you're in those moments, there's a fluidity that's happening. You do need to be able to recognize what's happening, but not be run over by it. So you do need a large container to play in. And if you are numb and muted on the emotional side of things, that container is much smaller. But at the same time, so that's all the pre-work to widen that container, to build depth of the container. At the same time, there's it's a forcing function that, no, not now. Come back to execution, come back to the most relevant task at hand. And if the emotion is not favorable to that deep attention, then it's not, it's gated out. But back to an earlier point that we were making is the ones that are changing the way the world works, they are honest with their emotional experience. But that's the pre-work.
Yeah.
The stuff on the edge is different. It's in like an execution mode.
And see, I always think, I love learning from the ones on the edge and the highest and the best. And then my mind always goes to this next generation. And I think what they're up against, and it always makes me feel old when I start saying these kids, it's like I don't want to feel like that because it's all about meeting them where they are and knowing that this is the world that they live in and how do we make it better for them. But there are so many things out there to numb, to take their attention, to make it more scary to be themselves. And you're raising a son.
Yes.
And I have 4, and from 22 to 16, and it's getting them to learn to help them be their authentic self. How can we use some of these things that the best of the best used to relate and bring it to their level?
That's been the working laboratory that I've been most interested in over the last 20 years is that central question. What are the best practices for people to become their very best? And how do we help people like myself and others, like you and your community, to use some of those best practices? And you said the word authenticity. It's overused, and And I'm not sure there's a better North Star in a lot of conversations. So that's why I'm super excited to say this. I just submitted my manuscript for publication November 7th to Harvard Business Review for a new book. And it's on the conversational FOPO, fear of people's opinions.
There we go.
And so I'm so happy that like I got it out. And
that's amazing.
Yeah,
Congrats. That's
yeah, I
huge.
know. I'm so excited.
Oh, I got chills. I can't wait to read it.
Thank you. And but the reason I bring that up now is because the fear of people's opinions is one of the great constrictors of one's potential.